The sharp crack in the stifling kitchen cut deeper than any wood smoke. Ince, hands trembling, snagged Mrs. Caldwell's satin gown, the fabric unraveling like a whispered confession. Lance, the estate manager, smirked. Some hands are for straw, not silk. Before she could retort, Mr. Thorne appeared, eyes like a winter river. "Let her be," he said. "I want to see how she finishes." Humiliation burned, but Ince lifted her chin, and her needle pulled thread with defiant dignity. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The air in the kitchen hung thick, heavy with the scent of simmering onions and the sharp tong of wood smoke from the old stove. Ince could feel it cling to her skin, a constant reminder of where she belonged. Her fingers, though slender, were calloused from years of mending and scrubbing, her nails worn down to nubs. That moment, when the expensive satin of Mrs. Caldwell's gown had caught on a stray splinter from the kitchen table, felt less like an accident and more like a cruel judgment. The sound wasn't loud, just a quiet asterisk, rip asterisk, but in the sudden silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. Ence's heart leaped into her throat. She stared at the unraveling threads, stark white against the deep navy fabric, and a wave of heat flushed her cheeks. It was just a dress, a silly, fancy thing, but it represented everything she wasn't, everything she couldn't touch without somehow tainting it. Lance, the estate manager, seemed to savor the moment. He stood by the doorway, a shadow of a smile playing on his lips, his chin always tilted up, as if he were constantly looking down on the world. His eyes, though, held no warmth, just a cold calculation. "Well, Ince," he drawled, his voice slow and deliberate, "looks like some things just aren't meant for hands like yours, huh? Silk's a bit too delicate." He pointed to the torn hem, his gaze lingering on her trembling fingers. "Some hands, dear girl," he continued, a false indulgence dripping from his tone, "were simply made for straw, or scrubbing pots, not for anything of real value." The words hit harder than any slap. Ince felt her cheeks burn, her vision blurring at the edges. She bit back a retort, a sharp comeback that would only dig her deeper. What was the point? He was right in a way. Her life was straw and scrubbing, not satin and polite society. Then, just as the words threatened to choke her, the kitchen door creaked open again. The sliver of late afternoon light stretched across the polished floorboards, framing Mr. Thorne, the owner of the vast Thorne estate. He was barely in his 40s, a widower for some years now, his presence always carrying a quiet weight. He was undeniably handsome, with eyes that could be as clear and cold as the Hudson River on a winter night. He took in the scene, Lance's sneering smirk, Enka's downcast gaze, the ruined dress. Instead of the reprimand Enka braced herself for, his voice was surprisingly soft, almost a murmur, yet it cut through the tension. "Let her be, Lance. Leave it alone. I want to see how she finishes the work." Lance's smile faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, but he simply nodded, stiffly. Mr. Thorne offered Ince a no direct look, no sign of sympathy, yet his words had created a fragile shield. Humiliation still churned inside Ince, a bitter internal splinter, but a tiny spark of defiance ignited alongside it. She took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying her hands, picking up the fallen needle. The thread, a thin, strong line, followed the sharp tip with a dignity that seemed to mock her meager circumstances. She would finish it. She would mend the dress, not for Mrs. Caldwell, but for herself, for the quiet strength no one seemed to see. The Thorne estate stretched across the rolling hills of upstate New York like an old charcoal drawing, its vastness breathing with the rhythm of seasons, sometimes hot and dry, other times crisp and cold, like some ancient slumbering beast. The main house, a grand sprawling structure of stone and dark wood, was illuminated by heavy chandeliers that dripped wax onto polished brass sconces. Its hallways, lined with dark, gleaming wood, echoed with every step, a stark austerity that reminded inns of the hushed solemnity of a church. In the cavernous ballroom, tall, ornate mirrors reflected the world with a slight, antique delay, and heavy, faded tapestries along the walls seemed to hold centuries of stories, tallies of bountiful harvests, fierce storms, and generations of the Thorne family. Ings, often nearly invisible, spent her days weaving in and out of these stories, mending linen, pressing clothes, polishing silver. She was a ghost in the grandeur, always present but rarely noticed. It was during one of her quiet, unseen tasks that things began to subtly shift. An old tapestry, depicting a hunting scene, had come loose from its frame, a gaping tear marring the intricate embroidery of a forest glade. She had been tasked with carefully resecuring it, her fingers tracing the worn threads. As she worked, meticulously stitching the fragile fabric back into place, Mr. Thorne happened to pass through the ballroom. He paused, his clear eyes falling on her hands as she mended the delicate threads. There was a quiet intensity in the way she worked, a certain silent resolve. He watched her for a moment longer than usual, then, without a word, continued on his way. A few days later, a message reached her through the housekeeper. More. Thorne wanted Ince, specifically, to undertake the full restoration of that particular tapestry. The request stunned her. It was an honor, yes, but also a challenge. These tapestries were not simple mending. They were art, history. Ince, with fingers that seemed to instinctively understand the language of fabric, approached the task with a reverence she usually reserved for the quiet mornings before anyone else woke. She set up her workstation in a sunny corner of the ballroom, surrounded by ladders and draped cloths, a strange, temporary fixture in a room usually reserved for grander things. No one seemed to notice her there, a quiet, focused presence among the faded splendor. But more Thorne did. Now and then, he would pass through, his footsteps barely audible on the ancient rugs, his gaze lingering for a moment on the progress of her needlework. He never spoke, never offered a comment, but Ince could feel the weight of his quiet observation. It spurred her on, a subtle, unspoken encouragement. A surprising twist came through the details of her work. Amidst the elaborate designs of oak leaves and wheat stalks, Ince began to introduce tiny, almost imperceptible marks, small, intricately embroidered seeds. They were nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them, woven into the background, hinting at new growth, new possibilities. Each tiny seed was a silent story of perseverance, a defiance against the decay of time. More, Thorne noticed. He didn't comment, not a word, but his eyes, those clear, firm eyes, rested for an instant longer on those particular stitches, a silent acknowledgement of her hidden message. The quiet recognition was a balm to Ince's spirit, a confirmation that her work, her quiet defiance, wasn't entirely unseen. It was a strange kind of intimacy, woven in thread and silence. Not long after, Mr. Thorne issued another, unexpected order. He wanted Ince to help catalogue old papers in the estate's sprawling library, documents belonging to his late wife, Mrs. Thorne. The library was a place Ence had only ever glimpsed, a hushed sanctuary of leather-bound books and ancient maps. Now she was granted access, moving carefully among the towering shelves, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and beeswax. She spent hours sifting through yellowed letters of gratitude from tenant farmers, meticulous lists of provisions through the household, and earnest promises of aid to the small community nestled just beyond the estate's gates. It was a window into the life of Mrs. Thorne, a woman Inlands had only known as a silent portrait in the main hall. The library work was monotonous but peaceful, a welcome change from the noisy kitchen. Ines found a rhythm in sorting the brittle documents, her movements slow and deliberate. But then, in a forgotten wooden box tucked away behind a stack of dusty novels, she found something else entirely: remains of old ledgers, bound in deteriorating leather. As she carefully brushed away the dust, her eyes, accustomed to the precise lines of needlework, began to register discrepancies. The numbers, carefully penned in fading ink, simply didn't add up. Not just small mistakes, but glaring omissions, inexplicable gaps between stated income and actual expenditures. It wasn't merely sloppiness, it was an elaborate arrangement, a carefully constructed illusion. Lance's wounded pride, his insatiable need for control and recognition, had found its stage in the silent, numerical theater of these account books. He'd clearly been skimming off the top, manipulating the estate's finances for years, all hidden in plain sight. Inks felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was bigger than a ripped dress. This was something dangerous. A few weeks later, on a cuttingly cold dawn, the barn was a symphony of animal sounds and the damp, earthy smell of wet hay and leather. Irons was doing her usual morning rounds, helping the older farmhands with the milking, when she noticed a young calf shivering violently in its stall. Its eyes were feverish, its breathing shallow and labored. The farmhands, experienced but weary, had already tried a few remedies, but the little animals seemed to be fading. Ines, who had learnt much about natural cures from her mother, herbs and compresses, approached the calf with a trembling but focused attention. She murmured soft words, her hands gently stroking its head, feeling the heat of its fever. She mixed a simple tea from dried elderflower and chamomile she'd brought from home, coaxing the calf to drink. Slowly, miraculously, under her tender touch, the calf's tremors lessened, its breathing eased. The farmhands watched, surprised, then nodded their quiet approval. From a distance, Mr. Thorne had observed the entire scene. He stood by the edge of the pasture, his breath fogging in the crisp air, his gaze fixed on Ines and the calf. In that moment, he saw in her tenderness a strength he had only intuited before, a quiet power that transcended her humble station. He saw not just a servant, but a healer, a nurturer. But Lance, always lurking, always watching, had also seen. He sidled up to a few of the older hands, his voice a low, insidious whisper. He suggested, with a knowing look and a shrug, that Ines was seeking undue attention, that the poor girl was trying to catch the master's eye, hoping to climb the social ladder on the back of a sick animal. The rumor, like a subtle poison, began to spread, tainting Inca's quiet act of compassion. The ballroom, that very night, opened its grand doors to a riot of light and perfume. It was the annual Harvest Festival, a lavish affair that filled the Thorne estate with the buzz of polite society. Chandeliers blazed, casting a golden glow on the polished floors and gleaming mirrors. From the tall, arched windows, a warm breath of late summer air wafted in, carrying the distant strains of a string quartet. Inns circulated among the glittering guests, her steps practiced and silent, offering trays of wine and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Her dress was simple, a plain dark linen, but around its collar she had discreetly embroidered a delicate design. It was the same motif she'd woven into the restored tapestry, a field germinating, tiny seeds sprouting into slender shoots, a symbol of growth and enduring life. It was her quiet rebellion, her signature, almost invisible in the opulent room. As she moved past a cluster of ladies, a sudden sharp voice cut through the polite chatter. "My goodness, look at that embroidery." It was Mars Albright, a notoriously gossipy socialite. Her eyes narrowed with a malicious glint. Lance stood nearby, a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement having passed between them moments before. Mrs. Albright, her voice rising slightly, turned to the woman next to her. "Doesn't that look remarkably like the pattern on that old French tapestry Mr. Thorne had restored? The one in the drawing room?" She then turned directly to Inks, her smile falsely sweet. "Tell me, dear, where did you find such a lovely design? Or," she paused, her tone hardening, "did it perhaps find its way onto your collar from one of the estate's noble pieces?" The room seemed to hold its breath. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the faint music. The accusation, though veiled, was clear. Inks was being accused of stealing, of appropriating a design from a treasured family heirloom, passing it off as her own. Inks froze, the heavy silver tray suddenly feeling impossibly light, as if she might drop it. Her face paled, all color draining from her cheeks. All eyes were on her. Mr. Thorne, who had been conversing quietly by the fireplace, had heard the exchange. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm, cutting through the stunned silence like a freshly sharpened blade. "Mrs. Albright," he stated, his gaze level and unwavering, "that embroidery was made under my direct order. The pattern was chosen by me, and the execution overseen by me. Miss Innes answers only to me for her work." His defense was immediate and unyielding, a glass shield placed between her and a sudden flame of scandal. It protected her, yes, but it didn't warm her. Inth felt a rush of gratitude, sharp and sudden, but it was quickly followed by a familiar ache. In his defense, in his assertion of ownership over her work, came the chilling reminder that everything, even this fragile protection, could be withdrawn at any moment. She was still just a servant, still someone he controlled, despite the quiet strength she now carried. The music resumed, a little too loud, trying to mend the ripped social fabric. Ingrams, holding the tray, felt the bitter taste of truth on her tongue. The night was far from over, and her precarious position had just been highlighted for all to see. Don't forget to like this chapter, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what you think will happen next to Inks and Mr. Thorne. The music at the Harvest Festival, a lively waltz, played on, but for Inks, it was just a dull thrumming in her ears. Mors Albright, flustered but unbowed after Mersch, Thorne's sharp rebuke quickly melted back into the crowd. Her gossip, a quiet hum that continued to ripple through the ballroom. In's ear, still clutching the heavy tray, felt like all eyes were still on her. Even as conversations resumed and laughter once again filled the grand room, Thorne had defended her, sure, but his words had felt less like an embrace and more like a brand. Asterisk Miss Ince answers only to me for her work. Asterisk, it was a public declaration of ownership, a reminder that her worth, her very presence in that room, was entirely dependent on his will. The gratitude she felt was a complicated thing, tangled with a fresh sting of vulnerability. It reinforced her place, a delicate balance between being protected and being utterly powerless. Lance, from across the room, caught her eye, a faint, knowing smirk on his face. He knew. They both knew. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days felt heavy, thick with unspoken tensions. Lance's presence around the estate seemed to intensify, his watchful eyes following Inth with an almost predatory focus. She tried to go about her duties as usual, mending, cleaning, ensuring everything was in its place, but the quiet strength she had found in her embroidery felt fragile, easily shattered by a pointed glance or a hushed conversation. She retreated into herself, finding solace in the repetitive motions of her tasks. But the calm couldn't last. The clear, crisp autumn days gave way to a brooding sky, bruised with purple and grey. The wind picked up, howling through the old chimneys, rattling windows in their frames. It carried the scent of an approaching storm, a raw, primal energy that matched the churning unease in Inka's own heart. The air felt charged, as if the very atmosphere of the Thorn estate was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. And break it did. That night, a storm roared in with a fury that split the night in two. Rain lashed against the house, driven by winds that sounded like a mournful wail. The old timbers of the roof groaned. The doors rattled violently in their frames, and lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the grand, old rooms in stark electric white. Inns, awakened by the tempest, lay in her small, Spartan room, listening to the cacophony. Suddenly a new sound cut through that in a persistent, rhythmic asterisk drip, 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 asterisk. It was faint at first, then grew louder, more insistent. Her heart pounding, she threw on a robe and hurried down the dark, echoing hallway. The sound led her to the library, a place usually so hushed and dry. To her horror, a stubborn leak had sprung in the ceiling, a relentless stream of water dripping directly onto a scattered pile of papers on one of the antique tables. Without a second thought, N sprang into action. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. These weren't just any papers. These were the very documents she'd been cataloguing for Mr. Thorn, invaluable records of the estate. She scrambled, moving with practiced efficiency, gathering armfuls of pages, her movements swift but careful. She grabbed any cloth she could find, old rags, even her own shawl, to soak up the spreading puddles. She used her body to shield particularly delicate books, pressing them against her chest, feeling the cold seep through her thin nightclothes. The storm raged outside, mirroring the frantic urgency inside. She worked in the flickering glow of a single candle she'd lit, its flame dancing wildly in the drafts, casting long, shifting shadows that made the room feel alive, watchful. As she gathered the damp sheets, a specific sheaf of papers caught her eye. The old ledgers she'd found earlier, the ones with the suspicious numbers. They were soaked, the faded ink bleeding into blotches, but the water, ironically, had revealed something new, something chilling, where the original figures had been. Ghostly imprints of altered numbers now became visible, smudged and faint, beneath Lance's neatly penned falsifications. The rain, instead of destroying the evidence, had stripped away the superficial layer, exposing the true, distorted figures underneath. It was undeniable. A cold shiver ran down Inky's spine, not from the chill of the wet papers, but from the stark realization of the deceit laid bare. Lance hadn't just been careless. He had meticulously, painstakingly, altered the estate's accounts, enriching himself at Mr. Thorn's expense. She quickly folded the incriminating papers, tucking them deep inside the apron she still wore, feeling their damp weight against her skin. The silence between the thunderclaps suddenly felt heavy, complicit. This was no longer just about her. This was about the very foundation of the estate. The storm eventually subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean. But the atmosphere inside the Thorne estate remained heavy, charged. Lance, emboldened by the whispers and his perceived victory at the festival, didn't waste time. He moved with a renewed swagger, his chin held even higher, his voice carrying an edge of authority that grated on Ince's nerves. He made subtle, yet pointed, remarks about the need for proper boundaries and the natural order of things within the household. He hinted at certain disruptions that needed to be rectified. It was clear he was building a case against Incus, leveraging her recent demotion from the library work to paint her as someone overstepping her station. One afternoon, in the long, polished wooden corridor leading to MR, Thorne's private study, a tense standoff unfolded. Ince was on her way to deliver a freshly laundered shirt, her footsteps barely audible on the gleaming floorboards. Lance, however, seemed to materialize from nowhere, blocking her path. His eyes, usually cold, now gleamed with a self-satisfied malice. "Good afternoon, Miss Ince," he drawled, his voice pitched just loud enough for a few passing housemaids to overhear. "Still running errands in the noble quarters, I see. My, some habits die hard." Ince tightened her grip on the shirt, her knuckles white. She said nothing, her gaze steady, refusing to drop it. Just then Mr. Thorne emerged from his study, his presence instantly commanding the space. He took in the scene, Lance's aggressive posture, Ingers's quiet defiance. "Is there an issue, Lance?" Mr. Thorne's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. Lance straightened, adjusting his tie with an air of theatrical concern. "No issue, sir. Merely a reminder. I was just remarking on the wisdom of maintaining proper decorum, you know. For the sake of the household's reputation, it can be misinterpreted. Miss Ince's frequent presence in these parts, and people talk." He gave a subtle, dismissive wave towards Ince. Given the recent incident at the Harvest Festival, it might be best if she resumed her duties in a more suitable area. The kitchen, perhaps, until things settle down. Mr. Thorne's eyes, those clear, river-like eyes, rested on Lance for a beat too long. A silent challenge in their depths. But then he sighed, a calculated weariness in the sound. He glanced at Irons, a brief, unreadable flicker in his gaze, then back to Lance. "You make a fair point, Lance," he said, his voice surprisingly mild, as if conceding. "I wouldn't want to give anyone cause for unnecessary gossip." "Very well. Ince will be reassigned to the kitchen until further notice." The words hit Ince like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. Until further notice. It was a dismissal, a demotion, a public shaming, all wrapped up in a polite, administrative order. Her heart sank, a heavy stone in her chest. She saw the barely contained triumph in Lance's eyes, the way he subtly puffed out his chest. More. Thorne had seemingly thrown her to the wolves, yielding to Lance's pressure. It was a humiliating setback, a harsh reminder of her place in the social hierarchy of the estate. She forced herself to nod, to keep her expression neutral, to swallow the tears that burned at the back of her eyes. She wouldn't give Lance the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would swallow her pride, her hurt, with the practiced skill of someone who had learned to survive by masking her true feelings. As she turned to leave, the fine silk shirt clutched in her hands. She could feel the stares of the housemaids, now fully aware of her public fall from grace. The polished corridor, usually a symbol of grandeur, now felt like a long, echoing tunnel leading to her confinement. Back in the suffocating warmth of the kitchen, the scent of baking bread and burning wood, usually comforting, now seemed to cling to ends like a shroud. It was the smell of her station, her inescapable reality. The other kitchen staff, usually a lively bunch, were strangely quiet around her, their glances shy and pitying. Minz didn't mind the silence. It gave her space to think, to process the searing humiliation of her public demotion. But beneath the hurt, a cold resolve was hardening. She had those papers, the ledgers that spoke a truth Lance tried to bury. She couldn't let his injustice stand, not just for herself, but for Mystra, Fawn, for the estate, for everyone Lance had undoubtedly cheated over the years. Late into the night, long after the last dish was washed and the kitchen staff had retired, Innes sat at the sturdy wooden table, the flickering light of a single candle her only companion. From the folds of her apron, she carefully extracted the damp, crinkled ledgers. The ink, though smudged, still told its damning story. With painstaking precision, the same meticulousness she applied to her needlework, she began to compile her own memorial. A detailed account of every discrepancy, every crooked number, every line that didn't align with the real harvests and expenditures of the estate. She wrote on scraps of paper, using a stub of pencil, her fingers aching, but her resolve unyielding. Each stroke of the pencil was a quiet act of defiance, a testament to her determination. She cross-referenced figures, noted dates, detailed the evidence with a clear, unembellished hand, describing each deviation, each altered sum, with the exactitude of a seamstress aligning a perfect seam. She thought she was safe in the anonymity of the kitchen, protected by the late hour and the sheer improbability of anyone discovering her secret work. But Lance, a man obsessed with appearances and control, had an almost uncanny ability to sniff out danger. He had been quietly fuming since M.R. Thorne's subtle, yet firm, defense of Innes at the Harvest Festival, and her subsequent demotion, though orchestrated by him, hadn't quite assuaged his bruised ego. He still saw her as a threat, a loose thread in his carefully woven fabric of power. He'd noticed her late-night vigils, the candle burning long after everyone else was asleep, and his suspicions, ever sharp, had been piqued. The next morning, as Innes rose to start her day, the folded papers, her carefully compiled memorial, were no longer tucked inside her apron. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. She searched frantically, her breath catching in her throat, but they were gone. Later that day, Lance found her in the pantry, ostensibly checking inventory, but his eyes held a cruel glint. He held up a crumpled piece of paper, her memorial. Enka's heart pounded against her ribs. "Well, well, Enks," he purred, his voice dripping with false concern. "What have we here? Such an industrious young woman, writing in secret. One might almost think you were plotting something." He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning her neat handwriting. A sneer twisted his lips. "Fascinating numbers. You've clearly spent a lot of time on this. Fiction." He turned, addressing a couple of scullery maids who were within earshot, his voice rising, gaining a theatrical edge. "It seems our ambitious Miss Innes isn't content with just mending dresses. Oh no, she's now fabricating financial records. Attempting to implicate honorable men, perhaps. To climb higher by slandering those who hold this estate together. It seems ambition truly makes one desperate enough to forge accounts and defame good people." His accusation hung in the air, cold and poisonous. The kitchen staff exchanged wide-eyed glances. Innes stood frozen, her blood running cold. She was trapped. The morning dawned with a biting chill, the fields still slick with dew, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Word spread like wildfire through the estate. Ince, the girl who had dared to mend a tapestry and challenge accounts, was to be dismissed. Expulsion. It was a ceremony of quiet humiliation, orchestrated with grim efficiency. A small bundle sat by the back door, a few meager belongings, a worn pair of shoes, her simple shawl. The world, which had briefly opened up with the library and the tapestry, was now narrowing, shrinking to the dusty track between the main house and the wrought iron gates. The other staff averted their eyes, unable to meet her gaze, a mixture of pity and fear on their faces. Innes felt a strange numbness, a dull ache that eclipsed the sharp sting of betrayal. She had known this might come, had braced herself for it, but the reality was still a crushing weight. Each step she took towards the door felt like walking through treacle, every breath a struggle. Her future, once holding a glimmer of possibility, now stretched before her as an empty, desolate road. She imagined the long walk back to the village, the shame, the knowing looks. The heavy silence of the house seemed to press down on her, an accomplice in her banishment. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, steeling herself. She would walk out with her head held high, just as she had sewn the silk dress. She had nothing, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. A young foreman, his face etched with embarrassment, approached her, his voice barely a whisper. "Miss Innes," he began, his gaze fixed on the ground. It's time to go. Don't forget to like this chapter, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what you think will happen next to Innes and Mr. Thorne. The morning dawned with a biting chill, the fields still slick with dew, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Word spread like wildfire through the estate. Ince, the girl who had dared to mend a tapestry and challenge accounts, was to be dismissed. Expulsion. It was a ceremony of quiet humiliation, orchestrated with grim efficiency. A small bundle sat by the back door, a few meager belongings, a worn pair of shoes, her simple shawl. The world, which had briefly opened up with the library and the tapestry, was now narrowing, shrinking to the dusty track between the main house and the wrought iron gates. The other staff averted their eyes, unable to meet her gaze, a mixture of pity and fear on their faces. Innes felt a strange numbness, a dull ache that eclipsed the sharp sting of betrayal. She had known this might come, had braced herself for it, but the reality was still a crushing weight. Each step she took towards the door felt like walking through treacle, every breath a struggle. Her future, once holding a glimmer of possibility, now stretched before her as an empty, desolate road. She imagined the long walk back to the village, the shame, the knowing looks. The heavy silence of the house seemed to press down on her, an accomplice in her banishment. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, steeling herself. She would walk out with her head held high, just as she had sewn the silk dress. She had nothing, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. A young foreman, his face etched with embarrassment, approached her, his voice barely a whisper. "Miss Innes," he began, his gaze fixed on the ground. It's time to go." Just as the words left his mouth, a figure emerged from the fields. Not from the grand front door of the house, but from the dew-soaked pasture. More Thorne. His boots were damp, covered in bits of grass and mud. His hair slightly wind-tousled. His eyes, clear as freshly washed steel, seemed to cut through the heavy morning air, taking in the small, huddled group by the back door, the foreman's bowed head, In's small bundle. A ripple of surprise went through the few onlookers. He rarely appeared so informally. He walked with a determined stride, his presence immediately commanding, silencing the already hushed scene. He stopped a few feet from Inkas, his gaze unwavering, fixed on her. "Hold on a minute, Thomas," he said, his voice carrying easily despite its quiet tone. The foreman, Thomas, startled, looked up. Mr. Thorne turned his attention fully to Inks. She felt a jolt, a flicker of something she couldn't name, hope, dread. Her mind raced, trying to decipher his expression. His face was unreadable. "She stays," he stated, simply, definitively. The words hung in the air, unexpected, absolute. The foreman looked confused, then relieved. The small cluster of house staff exchanged bewildered glances. Lance, who had appeared moments earlier, watching from a short distance with a triumphant smirk, saw his expression twist into a mask of pure fury. Mr. Thorne then turned to Inkos, his voice still measured, but with a new edge of purpose. "Inko, I need a personal copyist. Someone who can take information and translate it into straight lines, into truth that men try to bend. You've proven you have the eye for detail, the patience, and the integrity for that." His words were like a lifeline, thrown just as she was about to drown. Her mind, still reeling, tried to grasp the implications. A copyist, not the kitchen, not expulsion. She could feel Lance's burning gaze on her, but for once, she didn't care. Thorne looked at the foreman. "Thomas, please take Miss Inns's belongings to the small rooms next to the library. Have them prepared for her. She'd begin her new duties this afternoon." And with that, he turned, giving a curt nod to the foreman, and walked back towards the house, leaving In standing there, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. The reprieve was dizzying. The small rooms next to the library were a world away from the bustling, sweaty kitchen. They were quiet, bathed in soft, filtered light that came through a tall, narrow window overlooking a secluded rose garden. The air here smelled of old paper, leather, and faint lavender, a stark contrast to the grease and wood smoke she was used to. Her new quarters consisted of a small sitting room, which also served as her walk space, and an even smaller bedroom. They were modest, certainly not grand, but they were hers. For the first time since she'd arrived at the estate as a young girl, she had a space that wasn't shared, that wasn't temporary. A sturdy oak desk, laden with quills, ink and stacks of parchment, stood by the window, promising a whole new kind of labor for her calloused hands. Innes approached her new duties with a mix of trepidation and fierce determination. More, Thorne's trust, so unexpectedly given, felt like a precious, fragile thing she had to guard with her life. Her days were now spent poring over ancient maps of planting fields, meticulously copying contracts of purchase, and transcribing long-winded letters from suppliers. The rhythm of her work was slow, deliberate. The scratching of the quill on parchment, the gentle asterisk plink asterisk of the inkwell, and the steady beat of her own breathing became the soundtrack to a new life. She found a deep satisfaction in the precision required, in the act of straightening crooked lines, of clarifying dense, often convoluted language. It was like her embroidery, but with words, each stroke of the pen a stitch in the fabric of truth. She discovered a keen eye for inconsistencies, a natural knack for spotting errors that others might overlook. A skill honed by years of noticing the tiny details that made a difference. Her new position placed her on the periphery of M.R. Thorne's private world. He would often pass by her rooms on his way to or from the library, sometimes stopping, sometimes not. His visits were always without fanfare, without protocol. Sometimes he'd simply appear in her doorway, a slice of freshly baked bread from the main kitchen in his hand, which he'd offer with a simple, "Thought you might be hungry." Other times, he'd just stand there for a moment, a silent, contemplative presence, watching her work, his gaze steady and unreadable. He never lingered too long, never made her feel uncomfortable, yet his presence filled the small room, a silent acknowledgement of her existence. One crisp autumn afternoon, he stopped by with a new stack of ledgers, some of the very ones Lance had tried to manipulate. He set them gently on her desk. "Irons," he began, his voice low. "I know you were hurt by my decision in the corridor, my concession to Lance." He paused, looking out the window at the turning leaves. It wasn't a true concession. It was a calculated risk. I needed him to believe he had won, to become careless, to think he could pull the rug out from under me without me noticing. He turned back to her, his eyes serious. "I saw what you did in the storm, Inns. You saved those papers, and in doing so, you uncovered his deception. I needed time to gather my own proof, to build a case that couldn't be denied. So I needed him to think I was weak, so he would overplay his hand. You, in that moment, were my leverage, my eyes, my hands, for the truth I needed to expose." Ince listened, her heart thrumming. So his seeming betrayal was an act, a strategy. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a blend of relief and a deeper, more profound trust. He hadn't abandoned her. He had protected her in his own quiet, strategic way. "So, the humiliation," she said, her voice soft, "was part of the plan." He nodded slowly. "Unfortunately, yes. But never for a moment did I doubt your integrity, INS, or your strength. I simply needed to give Lance the illusion of victory." And, he added, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips, "You played your part perfectly. You never broke." Their shared understanding, forged in the quiet of her new workspace, felt like an invisible thread connecting them, stronger than any silk. It wasn't about romance, not in the way the estate gossiped, but about a deep, unspoken alliance. A quiet respect that transcended their stations. But Lance, oh Lance, he was not a man to be easily fooled or easily defeated. While M.R. Thorne and Ince worked in quiet concert, Lance simmered. His victory in having Ince removed from the noble quarters had been short-lived, quickly soured by her new, equally elevated position. He saw Thorne's frequent, though discreet, visits to her rooms, the hushed conversations, the air of purpose that now surrounded her. He saw his own power, so carefully constructed, slowly eroding. The ledger sheets he had so meticulously altered were now under M.R. Thorne's scrutiny, being copied by Ince, a girl he had dismissed as straw hands. He knew, with a primal certainty, that he was losing control. And Lance, above all else, needed control. Driven by a mix of fear and desperation, he decided to play his last, dirtiest card. He began to spread whispers, subtle at first, then bolder. He hinted to the housekeepers, to the stable hands, to the other estate managers, that Mr. Thorne's interest in Ince was not merely professional. "Funny, isn't it?" he'd say, with a knowing wink, "how quickly a man turns to a new face after a certain amount of time alone, especially a young, impressionable one." He pointed to the very tapestry Ince had restored, the one with her delicate embroidered seeds. "Those little seeds," he'd muse, his voice laced with venom. "They're not just decorations, you know. I heard they're codes, little messages meant to entice." He insinuated that Ince and Mr. Thorne were lovers, that the revered memory of the late Mrs. Thorne was being desecrated, that the embroidered seeds were not symbols of perseverance, but rather secret codes of seduction, a sly poor girl's way of weaving herself into the master's affections, and perhaps his fortune. The rumors spread like wildfire, carried on the crisp autumn air through every corner of the vast estate. The house itself seemed to vibrate with the hum of gossip, a low, unsettling drone, like the ground before a storm. Servants exchanged wide-eyed glances when Ince passed. Some pitied her, some scorned her, all watched her. Ince felt the heavy weight of their stares, the judgment in their whispers. It was a familiar feeling, this public scrutiny, but no less painful. It felt like her privacy, her dignity, was being stripped away, piece by piece, by the venomous insinuations of Lance. She kept her head high, her gaze steady, but inside, a raw, burning anger smoldered. She was being reduced to a scandal, her hard work and integrity dismissed as mere cunning. It was an old story, one she knew well, and she hated it. She hated that her quiet fight for truth was being twisted into a cheap romance novel. Meanwhile, Mr. Thorne had been moving with a quiet, unhurried purpose. He had orchestrated an internal inspection, discreetly arranged to coincide with the next Harvest Festival, which was just around the corner. He knew Lance would be at his most confident, his most performative, at such an event. The festival was usually a time of great celebration, a lavish display of the estate's bounty and the Thorne family's standing. This year, however, it would be the stage for a different kind of harvester reckoning. The grand ballroom, with its tall mirrors and Incas, now beautifully restored tapestries, would once again be thrown open to the light. But in the back rooms, away from the glittering crowd, the real work would be done. Papers would be confronted, numbers would be exposed, and Lance's carefully constructed lies would, hopefully, unravel. Ince worked feverishly in the days leading up to the festival, compiling the last pieces of evidence, cross-referencing every figure, ensuring every discrepancy was meticulously documented. She felt a strange mix of fear and fierce readiness. This was it, the culmination of weeks of silent work, of hidden truths, of whispered lies. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she bound the final sheaf of papers, her memorial. A true account gleaned from the original documents she had salvaged and copied. She knew the risk she was taking. If Marais Thorne failed, she would be utterly ruined, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. But if he succeeded, it would mean justice, not just for her, but for the countless others Lance had wronged. She looked at the polished oak desk, at the stacks of documents, at the quiet rose garden outside her window. This was her battlefield. The night of the Harvest Festival arrived, cloaked in a cool, star-dusted sky. The Thorne estate blazed with light, every window a golden rectangle against the deepening twilight. Carriages pulled up the long driveway, disgorging elegantly dressed guests, their laughter and chatter filling the autumn air. The ballroom hummed with anticipation. Mr. Thorne stood at the head of the main table, his presence commanding, yet remarkably calm. He surveyed the assembled guests, his gaze sweeping across the room, past the glittering jewels and expensive fabrics, past the restored tapestries and the grand chandeliers that cast their warm glow over the scene. He knew the rumors swirling, felt the undercurrent of tension, but his expression remained serene, almost detached. Ince stood a little apart from the main gathering, near a cluster of palms by one of the tall windows. She wore a simple dark green dress, a quiet echo of the estate's sprawling fields. Her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, held a modest stack of papers, her meticulously compiled records. She was pale, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her eyes, though wide, were clear and steady. She had faced down bullies before, had endured hardship and humiliation, and tonight she would not falter. Lance, ever the showman, stood near Mar. Thorn, his chin slightly raised, a smug, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He was already savoring the scene, basking in the glow of his perceived victory. The successful poisoning of Ingay's reputation. The hum of conversation in the ballroom, initially lively, began to quiet as Mr. Thorn raised a hand, calling for silence. The candelabras above vibrated slightly in the sudden stillness, their flames flickering in the gentle draught. The silence thickened, becoming so profound that Ainz could hear the faint scuff of late arrivals in the distant corridor, the soft creak of a door somewhere upstairs, even the subtle drip of wax from a melting candle. All eyes turned to Monsieur Thorn. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, "thank you for joining us this evening. Before we proceed with the traditional celebrations, there is a small matter of estate business that needs addressing. A matter of transparency." He paused, his gaze resting briefly on Lance, then sweeping across the room. "Lance," he continued, addressing the estate manager directly, "would you be so kind as to read, for everyone present, the official financial report for the past year?" Lance, surprised by the request, but still brimming with confidence, took the papers offered to him. He cleared his throat, a theatrical gesture, and began to read. His voice, usually smooth and authoritative, boomed through the room, reciting figures of profit and successful expenditures. He spoke of growth, of prosperity, of his diligent management. But as he read, the very words, carefully chosen, began to betray him. Thorn had not given him the papers Ince had copied directly. Instead, he held a set of official documents, cross-referenced and subtly altered, based on Ince's findings, where Lance declared a handsome profit. The paper he held, under Marat, Thorn's guiding hand, subtly indicated a loss when the true numbers were applied. Where he pointed to inevitable expenses, glaring duplicities emerged, sums that had no real backing, no corresponding service or purchase. As Thorn, with quiet authority, passed different sections of the official report from hand to hand among a few prominent, guest-trusted neighbors and influential community members, the reality began to sink in. The murmuring started low, then rose, a confused buzz of recognition and dismay. The air in the room grew heavy, the collective breath of the guests taken in slowly, deeply, as the truth began to emerge. Lance's smooth, confident facade, his carefully constructed mask of vanity and meticulous control, began to crack, showing the raw fear underneath. He stammered, his voice losing its ringing certainty, his eyes darting frantically from Mr. Thorn to Ince, then to the guests, then back to the damning papers. His perfect world was crumbling. Seeing himself utterly cornered, his carefully woven web of lies unraveling before everyone's eyes, Lance did what cornered animals do. He lashed out. He turned from the murmuring crowd, his face contorted in a sneer, his eyes blazing with a desperate fury, and focused all his venom on Ince. His voice, now fatally theatrical, rose above the confused whispers. "This is all her doing," he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Ince. "This girl, this poor, ambitious girl, she's manipulated everything. She forged these accounts to seduce you, Mr. Thorne, to worm her way into your good graces, to rise above her station. A few nervous titters rippled through the room, like poised laughter, a desperate attempt to cling to the old familiar narrative of the scheming servant girl. Inks felt the heat of 1,000 eyes, the sting of the accusation. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just her and Lance, his hateful words echoing in the vast room. But then, a profound stillness settled over her. The humiliation, the fear, the anger, they coalesced into a quiet, unshakable core. She lifted her head, her gaze meeting Lance's, then sweeping across the shocked faces of the guests. And then, from a place that seemed not of her chest, but of a root buried deep within her, a place of ancient strength, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a sharp blade, clear and resonant. "Nobody's strong enough for me," she said it, and then she fell silent, letting the words hang in the air, defiant and absolute. The ballroom, for a stunned second, didn't understand. The guests exchanged bewildered glances, confusion etched on their faces. Was it a denial? A boast? But the phrase, in its raw, wounded power, held the entire body of her story. Asterisk, nobody was strong enough to carry her as an object, to mold her like clay, to reduce her to a mere rumor or a whispered scandal. That asterisk, there was a force in her. Not a scream, but a quiet, enduring permanence. Ma Thorne, who had been watching Ginzy with an almost unnerving intensity, took a deliberate step forward, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't raise his voice, but his reply, quiet and firm, was like offering a bridge over a river everyone had declared impassable. "Then let me try ... Single quotes. The explosion, when it finally came, was not one of scandal, but of truth, clear and undeniable." Mr. Thorne, standing tall and resolute, addressed the entire room, his voice calm and steady, unwavering. "Lance's accusations are baseless and cruel. Let me be perfectly clear. My intention in saying then, let me try, is not to possess, not to have in mess, as he so crudely implies. My intention is to be strong enough to sustain her, to support her, where this house, where society, has tried to break her, to bend her, to ensure her dignity, her truth, are honored." He then began to speak of Inks's contributions, her true value. He revealed how she had, single-handedly, saved the vital estate records during the tempestuous storm, protecting them at great personal risk. He spoke of her meticulous work on the tapestries, how her stitches had not just restored beauty, but had, in fact, brought the very history of the house back to life, breathing new meaning into old threads. "And as for intimacy," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, "if there is any between us, it is the profound intimacy of trust in what is just, in what is right. It is the understanding that some truths, once discovered, cannot be unlearned, and some acts of courage, once witnessed, cannot be ignored." His words were like an unseen hand, shifting ancient, heavy weights. It was as if someone had thrown open long-closed windows. Fresh air rushed in, dust motes danced in the light, and the masks of pretense and rumor, suddenly heavy, began to fall away, not in a dramatic crash, but from sheer exhaustion. The truth, finally, had space to breathe. Don't forget to like this chapter, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what you think will happen next to Inks and Mr. Thorne. The ballroom was absolutely breathless. Angesta's defiant declaration, "Nobody's strong enough for me," had hung in the air like a raw, exposed nerve. followed immediately by Mr. Thorne's quiet, almost intimate response. "Then let me try ... single quotes. The collective gasp that followed was audible, a sharp intake of air from dozens of stunned guests. Heads whipped between ins, pale but resolute. And Mr. Thorne, his gaze unwavering, fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to ripple through the very room. Lance, however, was a portrait of pure, unadulterated fury. His face, moments before contorted in a sneer of triumph, now flushed a mottled red, his eyes bulging with disbelief and rage. He looked as if he might physically combust. His last, desperate attempt to turn the tables, to discredit Imps and paint M. Thorne as a fool, had backfired spectacularly, leaving him exposed and sputtering. But Mr. Thorne wasn't finished. He took another step forward, closing the small distance between himself and Inks, not in a way that suggested intimacy to the gossips, but rather a profound solidarity. His voice, clear and resonant, addressed the entire room, cutting through the thick silence, dispelling the fog of rumor and misinterpretation. "Lance's accusations are baseless and cruel," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, making direct eye contact with many of the more prominent guests. "Let me be perfectly clear. My intention in saying then, 'let me try,' is not to possess, not to have ins, as he so crudely implies. My intention is to be strong enough to sustain her, to support her, where this house, where society has tried to break her, to bend her, to ensure her dignity, her truth, are honored." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, his presence radiating an unyielding authority. Hinth felt a tremor run through her, not of fear, but of a profound, disorienting relief. His words were a shield, yes, but this time it was a shield forged of respect, not mere ownership. He was acknowledging her, truly seeing her. He then began to speak of her contributions, her true value to the Thorne estate, his voice now filled with a quiet, undeniable pride. "It was Ince," he continued, gesturing vaguely towards her, "who, at great personal risk, single-handedly saved the estate's vital financial records during the recent tempest. Records that, ironically, were being allowed to languish, unprotected." He then gestured towards the large tapestry on the far wall, now vibrant with its restored colors. And it was her meticulous work on these very tapestries, gentlemen and ladies, that not only restored their beauty, but brought the very history of this house back to life, breathing new meaning into old threads. He turned slightly, his eyes holding a direct, challenging glint as he looked at Lance. "And as for intimacy," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the guests, "if there is any between us, it is the profound intimacy of trust in what is just, in what is right. It is the understanding that some truths, once discovered, cannot be unlearned, and some acts of courage, once witnessed, cannot be ignored." In his words, delivered with such calm conviction, were like an unseen hand, systematically dismantling the old, heavy weights of gossip and prejudice. It was as if someone had thrown open long-closed windows in the grand ballroom. A rush of fresh, clean air swept through. Dust motes danced in the newly revealed light, and the masks of pretense and whispered rumor, suddenly too heavy to bear, began to fall away, not in a dramatic crash, but from sheer, collective exhaustion. The truth, finally, had space to breathe, to expand, to settle over the room, solid and irrefutable. Irons watched the faces of the guests, seeing confusion give way to understanding, then to a quiet, dawning respect. Mrs. Albright, the gossipy socialite, looked utterly mortified, her carefully powdered face now a stark white. The other staff members, who had stood frozen in the periphery, now straightened, a silent affirmation of their own dawning realization. Lance, however, was far from giving up. His eyes, burning with a desperate fury, darted around the room, searching for an ally, a loophole, anything to regain control. "This is preposterous," he bellowed, his voice hoarse, cracking. "He's clearly blinded by her charms. This is a setup, a conspiracy, hatched by a scheming and a weak-willed master." He pointed again at Ingrace, then at Mr. Thorne, trying to rally support, to invoke the established order, the centuries-old hierarchy of the estate. "I am the appointed manager. I have served this estate faithfully for years. My family has served this family for generations. These accusations are nothing more than a poor girl's attempt to climb higher through slander and manipulation." He appealed to their sense of tradition, to their ingrained class distinctions, trying to turn the tide of opinion back in his favor. But his words now lacked their former bite. They sounded hollow, frantic, out of sync with the solid, calm authority emanating from M.R. Thorne. The guests, having just heard Mr. Thorne's clear and reasoned explanation, no longer looked convinced. They now saw Lance not as the proud, capable manager, but as a cornered, desperate man, grasping at straws. The evidence, meanwhile, was being systematically laid bare. Thorne had arranged for several impartial accountants and legal representatives, discreetly invited as guests, to be present. Now, at a subtle nod from M.R. Thorne, they stepped forward, holding their own copies of the ledgers, the original, the altered, and Inca's meticulously transcribed truths, all cross-referenced with bank statements and supplier invoices that Mr. Thorne had quietly gathered. The numbers, presented methodically, relentlessly, composed a damning symphony of deceit. Receipts for non-existent supplies, duplicate entries for the same expenditures, inflated costs, missing funds. The truth, stark and unembellished, was undeniable. The auditors pointed out differing signatures, Trojan sums that simply did not close, expenses that vanished into thin air. Lance's carefully constructed world of deception crumbled under the weight of his own figures. He tried to interrupt, to protest, to invent excuses, but his voice was drowned out by the quiet, methodical presentation of facts. The silence, which had been thick with tension moments before, now became a powerful ally, allowing the cold, hard facts to penetrate every ear, every mind in the room, without the interruption of gossip or rumor. The house finally heard the truth without embellishment. Thorne, with the serene calm of a farmer surveying his harvest, allowed the evidence to speak for itself. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to publicly shame Lance with a dramatic expulsion. His actions were precise, measured, and devastatingly effective. "Lance," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying immense weight, "it is clear your stewardship of this estate has been compromised. You are hereby relieved of all your duties, effective immediately." He then extended his hand, not for a handshake, but for the heavy ring of keys that Lance always carried, a symbol of his authority over the estate. "Please hand over the keys to the main office, the storerooms, and the private ledgers." Lance, his hands shaking, fumbled with the keys, his face a mask of utter defeat. His pride, which had been his armor, found no blood to spill, but instead a stark, unyielding limit. He was reduced, in that moment, to nothing more than a disgraced employee. "You will retire to the modest guest quarters, where you will await a full audit by neutral parties. Until then, you are not to leave the estate grounds." The order was firm, undeniable. Lance, defeated and exposed, slunk away, his shoulders slumped, his once proud chin now bowed in utter shame. The grand ballroom, which had been his stage for so long, had become the place of his undoing. The aftermath settled over the Thorn estate like a cleansing rain after a long, stifling drought. The tension, which had been a constant, low hum, finally dissipated, leaving behind an unexpected lightness. In the kitchen, the daily rhythm of life continued. The warm scent of baking bread and burning wood, once a heavy reminder of Ingi's confinement, now carried a different meaning. It was more than just sustenance. It was a promise of days that would repeat with dignity, with transparency. In the fields, bathed in the golden light of the autumn sun, the farmhands and workers moved with lighter steps, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from their shoulders. The hushed whispers and suspicious glances gave way to open conversations, to shared smiles. The main house, in the soft glow of moonlit nights, lost its previous air of a silent courtroom and began to reclaim its true nature as a place of shelter, of community. Ince, her body still on alert, didn't miraculously transform into the lady of the manor overnight. That wasn't her desire, nor Mr. Thorne's intention. She continued to mend, her fine fingers still coaxing life back into worn fabrics. But now, she also wrote. Her desk, in the quiet rooms next to the library, became her sanctuary. She became the guardian of the accounts, the estate's personal copyist and interpreter of the intricate papers that dictated its destiny. Her needlework, alongside her writing, became her dual resistance, her unique way of shaping her world, to stitch together what was broken and to straighten what was crooked, mending and aligning. It was a beautiful, quiet evolution. Between her and Mr. Thorne, words remained largely contained. Their relationship wasn't one of grand romantic gestures, but of a quiet, deepening understanding, a profound respect forged in the shared struggle, and a common pursuit of truth. His eyes, however, spoke volumes. He was a widower, still carrying the quiet weight of loss, and he sought not to profane with impatience the delicate thing that was growing between them. At 42, he was much like the estate itself, vast, circumspect, made of silences and of winds that change without fanfare. In-laws, taught by a life of hardship, understood the value of this. Life had shown her that grand, sweeping gestures often wore thin, but small, repeated acts of kindness and trust were what truly sustained. Sometimes, in the long, polished wooden corridor, when the old floorboards creaked softly under her steps, he would pause, without a word, simply to listen with her to the faint sounds of the world filtering through the thick walls. It was a shared silence that didn't suffocate. It was a silence that supported. Before the new cycle of harvest, a small, intimate celebration was held, nothing like the boisterous, opulent parties of old. It was a simple affair, bread broken on the long kitchen table, a hearty soup that smelled of garlic and hope, and few but meaningful words. Thorne, standing among his re-energized staff, thanked them, his gaze warm and genuine. Without making any grandiose promises he couldn't keep, he announced that the estate would, from then on, operate with open accounts and less opaque walls, ensuring fairness and transparency for all. He then presented Nth with a sturdy, leather-bound notebook. This, he said, handing it to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly, is for the stories the numbers don't capture. For who falls ill, who learns, who returns, who resists? As the stove continued to exhale its comforting warmth, Inks realized that the future wasn't written with trumpets, but with straight lines, with the meticulous, honest strokes of a pen. Lance, the antagonist, didn't simply disappear. Men like him rarely evaporate. They merely recoil, only to return like dust motes when the windows have been closed for too long. But now they were watchful eyes, mirrors that no longer tolerated certain distortions. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Green, who had once been a silent accomplice out of fear of losing her own status, finally nodded in earnest when Mr. Thorne asked her for a frank and honest inventory of the estate's household supplies. Time, slowly but surely, began to realign what vanity and deceit had dislodged. When the moon poured its silver light over the fields, Ironsay often found herself walking down to the barn, her footsteps soft on the damp earth. She would pause by a stall, reaching out to touch, for a fleeting minute, the warm coat of a sleeping animal. She felt the world breathe, slow and whole, like the first deep breath after a long affliction. In that cool, slightly damp air, she understood that the words she had uttered in the ballroom, harsh, almost rude in their bluntness, were not a refusal of human connection, but a refusal of domination. "Nobody's strong enough for me" was a warning, a defiant assertion against any hand that would try to close around her, to own her, to diminish her. And Mr. Thorne's "then let me try ... single quotes, wasn't meant to contradict her, but to promise a different grammar, a different way of being, to sustain, not to constrict. In the end, the harvest came with the soft rustle of leaves, the confident footsteps of workers, and the quiet, easy sound of laughter. The sun brushed the rolling folds of the land with gold. The moon, with silver, touched what remained to be done. The majestic Thorne estate, once a stage for harsh whispers and hidden tensions, transformed into a place of small, firm gestures, trembling hands that learnt not to tremble, eyes once brimming with unshed tears that learnt not to deny, bated breaths that finally found the expansive rhythm of things made right. Incy, the invisible girl, had become a presence that no longer needed to ask permission, not out of arrogance, but out of profound merit. And Mr. Thorne, handsome, still a widower, with those impactful eyes, learned the difficult art of true strength, the humblest kind, offering a shoulder without demanding a knee, extending an arm without asking for a bowed head. The tapestries in the ballroom, beautifully restored, now told not just ancient tales, but also the story of a house that had dared to mend itself. The polished wooden corridors no longer echoed with the steps of fear, but now repeated the confident stride of purposeful work. The embroidered seeds, small and almost invisible, quietly flourished behind the scenes, as all true things do. Nobody sees them sprout, but everyone recognizes when they stand tall. So, what blossomed between Ince and Moore? Thorne was not a story of conventional romance, but an alliance forged in survival, in shared conviction. If there was to be a grand celebration of their connection, it would come in its own time. For now, the soft rustle of paper and the gentle sound of fabric being stitched was enough writing as resistance, harvest as hope, mending as rebuilding. And at the heart of it all, the enduring certainty that some silences crush and others save, that no true strength is measured by volume, but by persistence, and that where two people recognize each other without diminishing one another, the entire house, one day, breathes better. If this story brought a moment of reflection and emotion to your heart, don't forget to *** like this chapter asterisk asterisk. Asterisk asterisk. Subscribe for more stories asterisk asterisk that challenge the boundaries of fate. And asterisk asterisk, leave a comment below asterisk asterisk telling us what part touched you the most. Your engagement helps us bring more narratives of strength and resilience to life.